Okay, before I move on to equilibrium quantity and supply, quickly, the way we have demand shifters is also how we have supply shifters. So supply shifters are anything apart from the price of that good, like the selling price of the good or the price of the inputs resources used to produce the good, price of cost of production, anything apart from the price of that, the selling price of the good and the cost of the production. So for instance, technology, right? So technology, if there's more technology, then the producers will be able to produce more of the good, right? So technology and even number of sellers. So the higher the number of sellers, the more goods are available in the market. So these are examples of supply shifters. So supply shifters will basically shift the supply curve to the right. When you shift the supply curve to the right, what that means is that there's much more goods supplied. And when there's excess of something, then the price is going to fall down. So that would mean like the price, the selling price of the good is going to reduce in the market, right? At the same time, so let's say the technology has a fault, right, or the number of sellers reduced in the market, then the supply, remember, any other thing apart from changes in price, right? So the supply, not quantity supply, the supply is going to shift to the left, okay? It's going to shift to the left, okay? So remember, anything price causes a movement along the demand or supply curve, right? And then any other thing, other factors like, that I've mentioned are going to cause a shift. And when there's a shift, you call it change in demand or change in supply. When there's a movement, you call it change in quantity demand or change in quantity supplied. Okay, now back to equilibrium. What is equilibrium? Equilibrium is simply when the demand curve intersects with the supply curve. So you have a graph like this, you have your demand, you have your supply, and this is the interaction point, right? So the interaction point of supply and demand is going to give you what you call equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So remember, your price is on the y-axis and your quantity is on the x-axis. Okay, so that is equilibrium. So that's how it balances out. Remember, we talked about invisible hand. So the invisible hand is going to make sure that the demand and supply balance out to give a price and a quantity that everyone in the market is happy with. Okay. Now, depending if the shift in the demand, let's say the shift in the demand outweighs the shift in the supply, right? Then most likely the equilibrium price and the quantity would go up. So remember, so like if the increase in quantity demanded or demand is more than the decrease in quantity supplied or supply, then that means your equilibrium quantity and price are both going to go up. So remember, whenever there's less of a good, there's going to be scarcity, and that's going to increase the price. Okay. So, but however, if the decrease in the quantity supplied or supply is greater than the increase in the quantity demand or demand, then what do you think is going to happen? So again, because of less supply, the price is going to go up, equilibrium price is going to go up. However, equilibrium quantity is going to go down. Okay, so basically the overall effect simply depends on which change exceeds the rest. So whether it's the change in demand that overpowers the change in supply or vice versa. But yeah. So now let me give a quick illustration. So if there's a drought or a famine in the land and that leads to scarcity, it affects the output of the crops. So like scarcity of the product. So let's say we're looking at oranges. So there's a scarcity of oranges in the country. Then people are going to switch to the alternative, because if there's scarcity, then that means oranges are going to be more expensive and people are going to go into the alternative, which could be like demanding more apples, for instance. But now also remember that oranges are complements with orange juice, right? So if demand for orange goes down because the price has gone up for orange, then also the demand for orange juice is going to go down because they are complements. Okay, so for elastic goods, I want you to pay attention to this. For elastic goods, the higher the price, the lower the revenue. So remember I did that example of the table of price and quantity. So total revenue is simply multiplying your price times the quantity you sold at that price. Okay, so remember there are three steps in analyzing how your demand and supply responds to an incident, right? So the first thing is, okay, you evaluate, is the incident, the event that occurred, is it a demand or supply shifter, or is it a demand or supply mover, right? So once you do that, you are able to determine if it's moving along the demand curve, or if it's moving along the supply curve, or if there's a shift outwards or leftwards, right? That's the first thing. Then the next thing is, okay, after you determine, okay, let's say it's a shifter, right? Then you determine, okay, is it going to move to the left or to the right, right? So you determine, let's say you determine it's a shifter and it's affected the demand curve, then is the demand curve going to move to the left or to the right? If it's a movement that moves along the supply curve, then is it going to move upward or downwards, right? So that is the next step. And then you now determine which of the movements outweighs the other, right? So for instance, if supply curve is staying fixed and then the number of buyers in the market increases, then you know that demand is going to go up, right? But as demand is going up, supply hasn't changed. So therefore there's going to be, you see this new point here, there's going to be like an increase in price. So this is going to be EP1, and then at this increase in price, then most likely will be like an increase in the quantity. okay, to meet up with the demand. Okay, so yeah, so that is how you evaluate the impact of an event on the demand curve or the supply curve. And before quickly to wrap up chapter 4, there's something called sticky prices. So sticky prices simply means that when the price of a good goes up, it's very hard for it to come down. I'm going to give you a very good example of, for instance, necessities, right? So necessities like, let's say, salt, right? Because of how much we need salt or like even water, then the price of these goods are likely to ever come down. They most likely will just remain fixed around that prices, you know, even though they're going to come down, they're not going to come down by so much, right? So basically another example of a sticky price is wages. So when wages go up, it's very hard for wages to come down, right? So sticky prices just simply means that when the price goes up, it's very hard to come down because it takes time. You know, there's a lot of forces going on in the market, before the price is going to come down. So that is why countries try as much as possible to avoid inflation, because once there's inflation, it's very hard to bring those prices down. Okay, so that is sticky prices, and that wraps up chapter 4. Quickly moving on to chapter 5, let's talk about elasticity. So what is elasticity? Elasticity simply means how responsive is quantity demanded to changes in price. So remember we talked about this, when the price of a good changes, that is a movement along the demand curve, and that is called quantity demanded, change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied, as the case may be. But now we're talking about price elasticity of demand. So how responsive is quantity, change in quantity demanded to changes in price. So for instance, if the price of a good increases, what's going to happen to the quantity demanded, right? By how much is it going to change, right? Okay, so now what are the factors that influences price elasticity of demand? So let's start off with the slope. I'm going to call price elasticity of demand PED. So now let's talk about the slope. I'm going to draw two demand curves here. Okay, so now this is one demand curve. You have your P, your price, you have your quantity, price, and quantity. Now, let's assume at $2, you have this much goods being demanded. So let's say 10 units of the good, right? And then at $3, you have 5 units being demanded, okay? Now, keep that. You see that the change in the quantity demanded is 5, which exceeds the change in the price of $1. How about this one? So this curve is, you can see it's relatively flat, and this is an elastic. It's an elastic good, which means that the consumers are very responsive to changes in price. Okay. And this mostly happens when you have a lot of close substitutes. So if the price of, let's say, McDonald's is too high, you're just going to go to KFC, right? Because you have so many options to choose from. Remember competitive markets, okay? So this applies for an elastic good, and it usually has a much flatter curve. However, how about a good that is inelastic, which is the second graph? This second graph, can you see how steep the curve is, right? So let's still try, let's say $2. At $2, you have 5 units of the good being demanded, and then price goes up as much as $6. And the quantity demanded only reduces to 3. Can you see that? So that is an inelastic good. Inelastic goods are goods that you cannot do without. So necessities, right? So necessities like salt, water, no matter how the price of those goods increase, you're still going to buy. You might not buy as much, but you're still going to buy close to the same amount you were buying even before the price changed, because you cannot do without the good, right? So examples of inelastic goods, talk about salt, water, right? Necessities. There's also medicine. So you know medicine are expensive, like treatments, treatment for like sicknesses and all of that, like diabetes and all of that. It's very expensive, but you don't have a choice. You just have to like get the treatment in order to get better, right? So for people that are in those conditions. But for elastic good, examples are goods with close substitutes, and even like what we call luxury good. I'm sure you've heard of luxury goods, right? So luxury goods, if the price changes by too much, you're going to reduce your demand because you can't do without it, right? So these are examples of elastic goods and inelastic goods. So the next thing now is, so close substitutes just means narrow markets. So for a narrow market, so let's take cereal. There's so many brands of cereal, right? So if the price of one cereal brand goes up, you're just going to switch to another product, right? Another cereal brand, right? So the narrower the market, the more elastic the goods are. The broader the market, so when you're talking about cereal in general, or when you're talking about water in general, the more inelastic the good is. Something I want you to note is that for elastic goods, when you calculate your PED, it's going to be greater than 1. For inelastic goods, your PED is going to be less than 1. So what this means is that if it's inelastic, the quantity demanded responds less to the high changes in price, right? But for elastic goods, the quantity demanded responds more than the change in price, okay? So how do you calculate price elasticity of demand? It's just simply percentage change. I'm going to call change this delta sign, this triangle sign. Percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price, okay? What does this mean? This simply means, how do you get the change in quantity demanded? It's simply new minus old quantity divided by old quantity. this portion represents the percentage change in quantity demanded, okay? Now for percentage change in price, it's going to be new minus old price divided by old price. So now let's take a quick example. So assuming that initially the price of a good was $200, and at $200 you had 30 units of the good being demanded, okay? 30 units. And now the price falls to $150. So let's say they're doing a promotion or a sales, the price falls to $150, and at $150 you have 70 units of the good being demanded. So now let's take this example. What is the new quantity? The new quantity is 70, right? So 70, what is the old quantity? 30, divided by the old quantity, okay? Let's keep this. So this is supposed to be division, but if you remember your algebra, you can change division to multiplication and flip the numerator with the denominator, okay? So let's change this to multiplication and put old price at the top. So what is the old price? The old price was $200, right? And then the new minus the old price. So the new price is 150 minus the old price of 200, okay? So now let's quickly do this arithmetic. 70 minus 30 gives you 40 divided by 30 and times 200 divided by minus 50. So do you notice this minus here? This minus, which is going to be, our final answer is going to be minus because of the minus we have here. But basically the minus is just saying the negative slope between price and quantity demanded in law with the law of demand and supply. Okay, so by the time you do this calculation, you're going to see that you're going to get a PED that is greater than 1. So minus PED that is greater than 1, okay? So remember, you don't pay attention to the negative sign because this negative sign is just for the slope, your demand slope, okay? So what you're looking at is your absolute value of your price elasticity of demand, right? And since it's greater than 1, you conclude that it is elastic, all right? So now there are other values you can get for price elasticity. You can get greater than 1, you can get less than 1. So less than 1 would be like 0 point something, for instance, that would be inelastic, right? You can get a PED of equal to 0. When your PED is equal to 0, what that means is that it is perfectly inelastic. And perfectly inelastic simply means that your curve is going to look like this. It's going to be like a straight vertical line. So meaning that no matter how much price changes, at this price, the same quantity is demanded, 4 units, let's say at price of $1, at price of $10, the same quantity is demanded at 4 units, okay? So that just means that the consumers are not responding at all to changes in price because that good is extremely necessary that they cannot even reduce or increase their demand for the good, okay? So that is another type of price elasticity. You could also have your price elasticity equal to infinity. So if your price elasticity is equal to infinity, that means it is perfectly elastic. So perfectly elastic is the exact opposite of perfectly inelastic. Perfectly elastic means that it's just going to be straight like this. It's a straight horizontal line. And that means the producers cannot even afford to change the price at all because then the quantity is going to drastically change, okay? So that means consumers are extremely responsive to like changes in price. So most likely the price is going to never change, okay? And then there's another case called unitary elastic. Unitary elastic is simply saying that the change in the quantity demanded is equivalent to the change in the price. So change in quantity demanded and change in price would change by the same amount, right? So the curve would neither be too flat, neither be too steep. It would just be, the curve would just be like a balance, right? In between. Okay, now that's that for price elasticity of demand. Before I move on, there is something called midpoint price elasticity of demand. So when you're using the midpoint method for your PED, instead of dividing by your old quantity, you are going to divide by your midpoints, okay? Instead of dividing by the old price, you're going to divide by your midpoint. So what does midpoints mean? Midpoints means you're going to divide by the middle value between your old and your new. So for instance, here, what is the middle value? So the price, the quantity shifted from 30 to 70, right? So what is the new, what is the middle ground for 30 and 70? So that would probably be 50, right? So the middle ground between 30 and 70 is 50, so you're going to divide by 50. And then the middle ground for this, instead of dividing by the old, which is 200, what is the middle ground for 150 to 200? That will most likely be 175. Okay, so now based on this, your value is going to change, but only the magnitude is going to change, right? But the conclusion is still going to be the same, that it is elastic. So remember, for price elasticity, you ignore the negative sign because you're looking at the absolute value. The negative sign only talks about the negative slope and relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay, moving on. There's also income elasticity of demand. Income elasticity of demand is just saying how responsive are consumers to changes in income. So when your income changes, by how much do you change your demand for that good. So remember now I'm saying change your demand, not changing quantity demanded, because now this is a shifter of the curve, right? So how responsive are consumers to change in demand? So basically it's the same formula, but now instead of dividing by change in price, you're going to divide by percentage change in income. Okay, so here instead of having new minus old price, you would have new minus old income, and then your midpoint income. Okay, so that's basically it. So remember we talked about normal goods. So normal goods are when your increase in income leads to an increase in the demand, in your demand for the good, right? So that is a positive relationship. So for a normal good, you're going to have an IED. Where do I write this? You're going to have an IED that is positive for a normal good. So IED means income elasticity of demand. It's positive for a normal good, and then it will be negative for an inferior good. And remember, an inferior good, the lower your income, the more you demand for that good, right? So then you're going to have a value that is either positive or negative, and then that will tell you, by the time you do the calculation, if you get a positive value, then you know it's a normal good. If you get a negative value, then you know it's an inferior good, okay? And then for cross elasticity of demand, so cross elasticity of demand, cross price elasticity of demand is just saying, so remember we talked about substitutes and complements. So when the price of one good changes, let's talk about substitutes. We know that substitutes have a positive relationship between the price of good X and the quantity demanded of good Y. So by the time you calculate your cross price elasticity, if you get a positive sign, you know that it's a substitute good. If you get a negative sign, you know that it's a complementary good. But again, it's the same concept, just that now you're going to have percentage change in quantity demanded of X, good X. So let's say T will be good X, divided by percentage change in the quantity demanded of good Y. Okay, so now you have new minus old quantity of X divided by either the midpoint or the old quantity of X. Again, on this side now you're going to have new minus old quantity demanded of Y, good Y, in this case coffee, divided by the midpoint of Y or the old value of Y. So you could either use a midpoint or you could use divided by the old value to calculate any form of elasticity, right? Okay, so that's that about elasticities. Okay, something else that I want you to note is that for elastic goods, when the price of that good increases, so let's say a luxury good now, so let's say Mercedes-Benz. So if the price of Mercedes-Benz increases because it's a luxurious good, then people are going to reduce their demand for this luxurious good very drastically, and that would lead to a decrease in total revenue. Okay, so for elastic goods, increase in price leads to reduction in total revenue, because people are going to switch to the next best alternative because it's, they're highly responsive to changes in price. But for inelastic goods, it's the opposite. Increase in price is going to lead to increase in total revenue, because consumers have no other choice than to keep on buying the product even at the more expensive price. Total revenue is going to increase. Okay, so I think that concludes everything about price elasticity, and then the next video is going to be on chapter 6. If you have any questions, don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much.